Racist cops harass a poor black man, unaware he's the most lethal Green Beret sniper in history. Some weapons were never meant to be abandoned. Marcus Riley, America's most lethal operative, vanished into homelessness, seeking peace and anonymity. His government-sanctioned kills, buried in redacted files. His skills dulled by choice. Then, Officer Derek and his corrupt squad made their fatal mistake. A beating, a taunt, a homeless man humiliated for sport. They couldn't see the cold calculation behind his eyes, the muscle memory in his steady hands, the precision with which he counted each blow. Now, the predator awakens as bodies fall in a city, and a Crim Lord's empire burns. The truth emerges. Marcus Riley wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding the world from himself. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow's special episode is one you don't want to miss. Rain poured down in unforgiving sheets, transforming the city into a glistening nightmare of reflective surfaces. The water drummed against the cracked pavement, washing away cigarette butts and forgotten dreams into overflowing storm drains. Huddled beneath the meager protection of a faded awning outside Jerry's 24-hour diner, Marcus Riley sat motionless, seemingly unbothered by the occasional spray that found its way beneath his shelter. His weathered hands were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The diner's night manager, a weary woman named Sarah, had brought it out of pity or perhaps fear. Something in Marcus's penetrating gaze made people uncomfortable, made them want to appease him and move along quickly. His tattered military jacket hung loosely from his broad shoulders, the patches and insignia long since removed, but the disciplined posture impossible to erase. Years of rigid training had etched it into his very bones. The rain created a constant, soothing rhythm that allowed Marcus to focus, to process information like he had been trained to do. Every detail around him registered with crystal clarity. The nervous woman clutching her purse as she hurried past, her eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. The man checking over his shoulder 3 times in 30 seconds, a small-time dealer probably expecting a rival, or the cops. The teenage couple sharing an umbrella and giggling as they splashed through puddles, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the grim reality of the streets. His dark eyes tracked movement automatically, categorizing threats, escape routes, vulnerabilities. Old habits hard to break. Even in this self-imposed exile, the instincts remained sharp. His fingers twitched slightly as headlights swept across the wet pavement. A patrol car rolled to a stop in front of the diner, its red and blue lights remaining off, but its presence immediately changing the atmosphere of the quiet street corner. He didn't move, didn't even blink as the doors opened and 4 uniformed officers stepped out into the rain. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a permanent sneer etched onto his face, surveyed the street before his eyes landed on Marcus. Something like satisfaction flickered across his features. "Well, well, well," Officer Quentin Derrick drawled, sauntering toward the homeless man. "Look what we've got here, boys. This spot's not a hotel, old-timer." Marcus remained still, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the officers, a technique he'd learned to detach himself from unpleasant realities. His stillness seemed to irritate Derrick, whose hand dropped casually to the baton at his belt. "I'm talking to you," Derrick said, his voice hardening. "You deaf or just stupid?" "Neither, sir." Marcus's voice was quiet but clear, each word precisely enunciated. There was no fear or anger in it. It was just a flat statement of fact. Years of training had taught him to control his emotions, to use them as weapons rather than be controlled by them. Derrick's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged glances with his companions. One of them, younger than the others, with an uncomfortable expression on his face, hung back slightly. "Oh, we got a smart one," Derrick chuckled. "Hayes, you hear that? He called me sir." He turned back to Marcus. "What's in that bag? Booze? Drugs?" "Just personal items," Marcus replied, his gaze finally shifting to meet Derrick's. "Nothing illegal." That gaze seemed to unsettle Derrick for a moment. Something in those dark eyes that didn't match the circumstances, didn't belong to a man living on the streets. They were too alert, too assessing, too knowing. But the moment passed, and Derek's face hardened again. Let's see about that. Without warning, he kicked at the weathered duffel bag beside Marcus, sending it skidding across the wet sidewalk. The contents spilled out: a worn toothbrush, a crumpled paperback book, a change of clothes, and a small metal box that clattered against the concrete. Sarah, watching from inside the diner, gasped softly. Marcus tensed just slightly, his eyes tracking the metal box. It was the one item he truly valued, a tangible link to a past he was trying to both escape and remember. "What's so special about this?" Derek asked, stooping to pick it up. "Personal items," Marcus repeated, rising to his feet in one fluid motion that should have been impossible for a man his age. "Nothing illegal." Derek popped the lid open, revealing a set of dog tags and a faded photograph. "R.H. military man, huh?" he sneered, dangling the dog tags. "What are you now? Just another bum who couldn't hack it in civilian life?" For a brief moment, something dangerous flashed in Marcus's eyes, a cold, calculating look that made the younger officer, Hayes, take an instinctive step back. Years of suppressed rage and pain threatened to surface, a tidal wave of destruction waiting to be unleashed. He fought it back, forcing himself to breathe and remember why he had chosen this path. "You should put those back," Marcus said quietly. Derek laughed, letting the tags drop into a puddle. "Or what, old urine? You gonna fight the whole police department?" Hayes cleared his throat. "Sarge, maybe we should just—" "Shut it, rookie," Derek snapped. "You're here to learn, not talk." He turned back to Marcus. "This sidewalk needs to be cleared. Public safety hazard. You understand?" With a casual swipe of his boot, Derek sent the rest of Marcus's belongings into the gutter, where the rain immediately began carrying them toward the drain. The worn book floated for a moment before being sucked down. The other officers chuckled, but Hayes remained silent, watching Marcus with growing unease. He joined the force hoping to make a difference, but he was quickly learning that the reality was far more complicated. Marcus didn't move to retrieve his things. He simply stood there, rain soaking through his jacket, his eyes never leaving Derek's face. Something in that stillness should have warned them, the coiled tension of a predator deciding whether to strike. "You deaf again?" Derek asked, prodding Marcus's chest with his baton. "I said move along." "I'm not bothering anyone," Marcus replied evenly. "You're bothering me." Derek jabbed harder with the baton, clearly expecting anger, fear, some reaction that would justify escalation. Instead, Marcus simply looked at him with those penetrating eyes that had seen battlefields and blood, and had calculated distances for kills most men couldn't imagine. It was a look that had made hardened fighters back down, a look that said death was just a calculation away. Something in that gaze finally penetrated Derek's arrogance, making him falter momentarily. But an audience of fellow officers pushed him forward. "That's it," Derek growled, grabbing Marcus's arm. "You're coming in for disturbing the peace." What happened next was so quick that later, when Hayes tried to describe it in his report, he couldn't quite capture the fluid motion. One moment Derek had his hand on Marcus's arm, the next he was stumbling backward, off balance, as if struck by an invisible force. "Don't touch me." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of an absolute command. Derek's face was filled with anger and embarrassment. "Take him down!" he barked to the other officers. They rushed forward together, and this time Marcus didn't resist. Perhaps he realized the futility, or perhaps he had already made a different calculation. For armed men against one, with more only a radio call away. Those weren't odds even he would take. Not yet. They dragged him to the wet pavement, one officer wrenching his arms behind his back while another kicked his legs out from under him. Marcus went down hard, his face scraping against the concrete. Blood mixed with rainwater running in pink rivulets down the sidewalk. Sarah gasped again, turning away from the window, unable to watch. Through it all, Marcus never made a sound. No grunt of pain, no plea for mercy. He simply closed his eyes and breathed deeply, rhythmically, as if counting. 1. A flash of memory. Sand-colored hills viewed through a scope, the crosshairs settling on a warlord's head from 800 yards away. The gentle exhale as his fingers squeezed the trigger. 2. The taste of snow and blood. The wind whipping across a frozen mountain pass. 3. The officer's mocking laughter echoed oddly in his ears as they hauled him to his feet, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Not so tough now, are you?" Derek sneered, cuffing Marcus's hands behind his back with unnecessary force. 4. A dark alley in Prague. The metallic tang of fear. The silent takedown of 3 assassins. 5. The burning heat of the desert sun. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. 6. A face in the crowd. Recognition. A predator assessing its prey. They shoved him toward the patrol car, his belongings left scattered and forgotten in the gutter. As they pushed his head down to load him into the back seat, Marcus's eyes met Hayes. The young officer looked away quickly, unable to hold that penetrating gaze. "Enjoy jail, old man," Derek laughed, slamming the door shut. In the patrol car's confined space, Marcus sat perfectly still, his posture military straight despite the handcuffs. Blood dripped steadily from his face onto his jacket, but he paid it no mind. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused and alert. Hayes slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he caught Marcus's reflection, those eyes looking back at him with an intensity that made him quickly avert his gaze from the mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't transporting a homeless vagrant to lockup. The sensation crawling up his spine whispered something much more alarming. He was sharing a confined space with something lethal. The drive to the precinct was silent, the rain drumming on the roof the only sound. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Marcus spoke for the first time since his arrest. "You should have left me alone." His voice was soft, almost conversational, but something in it made Hayes' hands tighten on the steering wheel. It was not a threat, but a warning. Derek, sitting in the passenger seat, just smirked. "Yeah? What are you going to do about it, tough guy?" Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The smirk on Derek's face was the confident expression of a man who had no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The holding cell smelled of bleach and despair, an all too familiar cocktail that Marcus had encountered in war zones worldwide. The gray concrete walls were etched with crude graffiti, names, dates, and obscenities, the desperate markings of men trying to leave some trace of themselves behind. Marcus sat on the metal bench, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Blood had dried on his face in flaking ribbons, but he made no move to wipe it away. His eyes remained alert, scanning his surroundings methodically, noting the cameras, the guard rotations, and the weak points in the cell door. His mind worked like the weapon it had been honed to be, processing information, calculating odds, and planning contingencies. To an observer, he appeared still, almost meditative. Inside, he was anything but. 3 exits from the holding area. 2 guards on night shift. Camera blind spot in the northeast corner. Officer Hayes, uncertain, conflicted, potential leverage. Officer Derek, sadistic, corrupt, primary threat. Marcus's fingers twitched slightly, muscle memory from thousands of trigger pulls. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. Not now. Not yet. This was a chess game, and he was several moves ahead. The precinct hummed with nighttime activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, occasional bursts of laughter. Through it all, Marcus waited, patient as the trained hunter he was. He let the city sounds fade to a quiet background hum, focusing on the task at hand. The gears were beginning to turn. Officer Daniel Hayes couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled over him since they'd brought in the homeless man. Something about him was off. The way he moved, the way he observed everything, the absolute absence of fear in his eyes. Nobody who lived on the streets should have eyes like that. Against his better judgment, Hayes opened the booking system and entered Marcus Riley's fingerprints into the database. It was standard procedure, but something told him the results wouldn't be standard at all. As the computer processed the request, Hayes fiddled with the pen in his pocket, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a kid. He expected the usual, maybe some minor offenses, vagrancy charges, possibly substance abuse. Instead, a red flag popped up on his screen. Classified. Clearance Level 5 required. Contact Department of Defense immediately. Hayes stared at the screen, blood running cold. What the hell? Level 5 clearance was beyond anything he'd ever encountered, beyond what even the police captain possessed. This was territory he wasn't supposed to see. What have you got there, rookie? Derek's voice made Hayes jump. The sergeant leaned over his shoulder, peering at the screen with narrowed eyes. I'm not sure, Hayes said carefully, trying to mask his surprise. The system flagged him. Says we need to contact the DoD. Derek snorted. Department of Defense for a homeless bum? System's glitching. Happens all the time. The phone on Hayes' desk rang, cutting him off. He answered hesitantly. Officer Hayes. The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative. This is Colonel Alastair Croft, DoD Special Operations Division. You have a man in custody, Marcus Riley. Release him immediately. Hayes' stomach dropped. Sir, This is not a request, officer. That man is not to be detained. Clear his record of tonight's incident, and release him now. May I ask why? You may not. This conversation is over. The line went dead. Hayes slowly replaced the receiver, feeling Derek's expectant stare. Well? The sergeant demanded. That was the DoD, Hayes said, his voice strangely hollow. They want us to release him immediately. Derek laughed. You're kidding me, right? Some homeless guy has friends at the Pentagon. They seem serious, Sarge. Very serious. And you should have seen the clearance level to access his information on the computer. It's government red tape. Derek dismissed with a wave of his hand. Probably some administrative mix-up. He stays put until morning. That's an order, Hayes. Drop it. Derek stalked away, leaving Hayes staring at the phone, wondering what kind of man generated calls from colonels in the middle of the night. This was more than just a mistake. This was a cover-up. In the darkness of the cell, Marcus's mind drifted, not to sleep, but to the calculated recollection of past operations. Memory was a tool, like any other, to be honed and maintained. He was a living weapon, always ready for a fight. The jungle canopy of Cambodia, dense and suffocating. Sweat trickling down his spine as he lay motionless for 18 hours, waiting for his target to appear. The gentle pressure of his finger on the trigger, the controlled exhale, the distant spray of red as a terrorist leader's head exploded like a ripe melon at 1,200 yards. The mountains of Afghanistan, bitter cold numbing his fingertips as he lined up a shot that others had called impossible. 3 Taliban commanders in a moving vehicle, weaving through mountain roads. 3 shots, 3 bodies, 30 seconds. A new long-distance record for kill confirmations. The desert outside Fallujah, sand grinding in his teeth as he provided overwatch for a SEAL team extraction. 12 hostiles eliminated without a single Allied casualty. His rifle barrel so hot it nearly burned his hands. These weren't dreams or nightmares. They were records, data points, evidence of what he was capable of when necessary. And after tonight, it might become necessary again. Morning arrived with harsh fluorescent lights flickering on and a guard banging on the cell door. Riley, you're out. Marcus opened his eyes, looking exactly as he had the night before, alert, composed, ready. He stood without a word and followed the guard through the processing area, where a scowling Derek waited with his paperwork. Looks like you've got friends in high places, Derek said, shoving a plastic bag containing Marcus's few recovered possessions across the desk. Don't think this changes anything on my streets. Marcus said nothing as he reclaimed his belongings. The metal box with his dog tags was missing, likely still lying in some gutter where Derek had dropped it. His eyes registered this fact without emotion. Loss was a constant companion, an expected consequence of his life. Nothing to say? Derek taunted. No thank you for the night's accommodations? Marcus's gaze flicked to Derek's face, then away, dismissing him as unworthy of response. That subtle dismissal infuriated Derek more than any words could have. "This isn't over," the officer hissed. Marcus walked past him toward the exit, where Hayes stood awkwardly by the door. As he passed the young officer, Marcus paused momentarily. "Choose carefully who you follow," he said quietly, then continued on his way. Hayes watched him go, his uneasy feeling intensifying. The man moved like a predator, every step purposeful, balanced, and ready, not like someone who had spent the night in a cell but like someone preparing for war. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the rain clouds, leaving the city steaming and humid. Marcus walked steadily away from the precinct, his pace unhurried but covering ground efficiently. His eyes constantly scanned his surroundings: rooftops, alleyways, parked cars. 3 blocks from the station, he noticed a black SUV idling at a corner. It was a government issue, with tinted windows, and 2 men inside were watching him with professional interest. Marcus continued past without acknowledging them, but his mind registered their presence and filed it away. He was being monitored. He had expected as much. He turned down a narrow alley between 2 abandoned warehouses, a shortcut to a homeless camp where he occasionally sought shelter. The alley was empty when he entered it, but his trained senses detected the subtle shifts in air currents as bodies moved into position behind him. 4 men spread in a semicircle, blocking his exit. Not police. Their movements were too fluid, too practiced. Military training or close to it. Hired muscle with experience. They all smelled like trouble. Marcus continued walking for several more steps before stopping, his back still to the men. "That's far enough," a voice called out. "Mr. Langston wants a word with you." Marcus turned slowly, hands visible at his sides, his expression neutral as he assessed his opponents. 2 carried knives, 1 had brass knuckles, and the 4th, hanging back slightly, had a hand inside his jacket where a shoulder holster would be. "I don't know any Langston," Marcus replied calmly. The apparent leader, a muscular man with a scar running along his jawline, stepped forward. "He knows you, though. Says you caused him a lot of trouble overseas once upon a time." "Ah, that clarified things. Julian Langston, former CIA contractor, current arms dealer and human trafficker." Marcus had dismantled one of his operations in Eastern Europe 5 years ago, a sniper shot that had taken out Langston's regional commander and sent the organization into chaos. Langston had been waiting for a chance at revenge ever since. "I'm not interested in a reunion," Marcus said. "Not really an option," Scar replied, flicking open a switchblade. "You're coming with us, or you're not going anywhere ever again." Marcus's eyes went cold. The last trace of humanity draining from them as combat calculations replaced conscious thought. For opponents, limited space. No firearms of his own. Acceptable odds. The fight lasted exactly 27 seconds. Later, witnesses would tell responding officers conflicting stories. Some swore there were gunshots. Others insisted the homeless man had help. One woman claimed he moved like something from a movie, all blur and impossible angles. The truth was simpler, and more terrifying. Marcus Riley was the most efficient killing machine the United States military had ever produced, and these men were amateurs by comparison. The first attacker lunged with his knife. Marcus stepped inside the thrust, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted. The sharp crack of breaking bone was followed by a scream as Marcus used his momentum to drive the knife into his thigh, severing the femoral artery. The second man swung his brass knuckles in a wide arc. Marcus ducked under the blow, drove 2 precise strikes to the man's throat, crushing his trachea, then pivoted to face the third attacker. This one was more cautious, circling with his knife held low. Marcus waited perfectly still until the man committed to a thrust, then he moved, a blur of lethal precision, catching the knife hand, breaking the elbow with a short strike, and driving the man's head into the brick wall with enough force to fracture his skull. The fourth man had his gun out now, but hesitated, a crucial half-second, at the sight of his companions falling so quickly. Marcus closed the distance in 2 strides, trapped the gun hand, and fired the weapon into his torso twice before disarming him. 4 attackers. 4 bodies. 27 seconds. Marcus checked the gun, a Glock 19, 3 rounds remaining, and tucked it into his waistband before quickly searching the bodies. He found what he expected: burner phones, cash, no identification. Professional enough to maintain anonymity, but not professional enough to survive. He took one of the phones and dialed a number from memory. When it connected, he spoke just 3 words. "They found me." Without waiting for a response, he ended the call, dropped the phone beside one of the bodies, and walked calmly out of the alley. By the time police sirens wailed in the distance, he was already 6 blocks away, merging into the morning crowd of commuters. Officer Derek was halfway through his second coffee of the shift when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. "Derek. Your homeless guy just killed 3 of my men in under a minute." The voice was cold, controlled, but with an undercurrent of fury. "The 4th won't make it to the hospital." Derek nearly choked on his coffee. "Who is this?" "The man who's been paying your department to look the other way while I do business in your city. And now I learn you've been harassing a ghost, a man the government pretends doesn't exist because what he did for them was too dark to acknowledge." "Langston?" Derek's voice dropped to a whisper, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "What are you talking about? He's just some bum. That bum has the highest confirmed kill count in Special Forces history, more than any sniper, any assassin, any Black Ops specialist they've ever fielded. The kind of weapon they point at problems they want to disappear permanently." Derek's blood ran cold. "What's his real name?" "Marcus Riley is his real name. They never bothered with aliases because no one who saw him in action was left alive to identify him. And now, thanks to you, he's active again, and he's in my city." "I didn't know." "Fix this," Langston snapped. "Find him, kill him, or I'll consider our arrangement terminated, along with your employment." The line went dead. Derek stared at his phone, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as the realization sank in. He hadn't arrested a homeless vagrant last night. He'd poked a sleeping lion. As the sun began to set over the city skyline, Marcus stood on an abandoned bridge spanning the industrial district below him. The river flowed sluggishly, carrying the city's forgotten refuse out to sea. He was no longer in his tattered clothes. A visit to an old contact, a former Marine-turned-arms dealer who operated out of a pawn shop in the bad part of town, had provided him with fresh attire, a prepaid phone, and a shoulder holster for the Glock. The metal box containing his dog tags remained lost, but it didn't matter now. The man those tags had belonged to, the soldier, the patriot, the believer, was long gone. What remained was something else entirely. A weapon that had been pointed at a target. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming text, a single line of text from an unnamed contact. "Langston has ordered full surveillance. All assets deployed." So it began. The hunter was now the hunted, or so Langston thought. In truth, Marcus had been hunting all along, waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. Derek and his corrupt officers had simply accelerated the timeline. "I warned you," Marcus murmured to the darkening sky. "I warned you to leave me alone." In the gathering shadows, his eyes gleamed with cold purpose. The forgotten warrior had remembered his purpose, and now a city would remember his wrath.